right. You gonna start us off, Steve? You gonna start us off, Steve?
Yep.
Okay.
I sure can. All right, so today we are on practices and techniques. This is session 3, and oops, let me change my notes, sorry. Our session goal today is increase parent strategies for appropriately punishing behavior. I am Steve. I have 2 children, 26 and 16, and a very young grandchild. And Trish?
I'm Trish. I have 4 kids, 26, 21, 18, and 9. And also 1 6-month-old grandson.
And if anyone wants to type into the chat box their kids' ages, that would be awesome. Two boys, 3 and 6, and helping to raise 5 and 14-year-old. There's a lot going on right there. Thank you very much. All right. So last week we talked about praise and rewarding behavior. Did anyone have any experiences with or thoughts about these concepts since last week? I am always thinking about that aspect of praise in parenting and how important it is, and how it's one of the things that it's the easiest for us to forget. We're always focused on kind of the kind of the things that we view as being negative, or the things that we're concerned about the most. So I'm always really trying to be hyper-focused on what are the good things that my kids do. Because what I pay attention to is what I'm going to get the most of. So if I pay more attention to the good things, then I'll probably get the good things. So a comment here I have is I'm always thinking about not to overpraise or over reward, and making sure that actions I am rewarding are positive ones. Yep, that's great. Excellent.
I think one that I've been thinking about a lot, I think we talked about this week, but I think we talked about this last week, is the first then or when then. Did we talk about that last week? When you do this, then you can do that.
We did.
And so as we're hitting the wind down phase of remote learning through school, my daughter's motivation has also been hitting the wind down phase, and it's been getting harder and harder to get her to finish up those loose ends kind of assignments that are out there. So we've been doing a lot of that. First do this, then you can do that, or when this is finished, then you can do that. And I think the one thing, maybe the point that we didn't bring up last week when we talked about when then, is that I think if we get better at that as parents, it leads us into this idea of saying yes more. So when a child asks you for permission to do something, I'm not sure why, but I feel like for most of us, our natural instinct is to say, no, you can't do this because you haven't done that yet. When what we really mean is, yes, you can do that as soon as this is finished.
Exactly.
And those sound incredibly different in children's ears. So they get to the same point, the point being the parent wants this task accomplished before we're going to grant this permission. But saying, no, you can't do that because you haven't finished this, or no, you can't do that until that is done. When you start the sentence with no, I think that kids are sort of automatically pre-programmed to balk at that, to get defensive about all they're hearing is the no part of that sentence. And so we can just retrain ourselves to answer that question in the affirmative instead of in the negative. Yes, you absolutely can do that. Actually, this sounds like a really good idea. I just need you to finish this first. Then kids are hearing the positivity in, I just got permission to do the thing that I was asking to do. Yes. And tend to be much more cooperative about doing that other task first. So I think that's another thing that I've been focusing on this week.
As your kids move into the teenage years, that becomes even more important because they need to hear yes more often, and they need to feel like they have some control over their life. So
in one of our other curriculum, we talk about it in terms of winning cooperation with kids, right? And I think that's what that's about. It takes a step towards winning their cooperation, which is so much easier than having a power struggle, and usually more pleasant for everyone involved.
For sure. All right, so last week we talked about those if or when then statements. And if you remember in parenting, the if or the when is the child's behavior, and the then is our response to that behavior. So when you clean your room, then you can have your friend come over, or whatever the task is you need them to complete. We also talked about praise and rewards as a response to appropriate behavior. So today we're going to be talking about punishment as a response. So ways in which we use punishment to hopefully correct inappropriate behavior. When I say the word punishment, if you want to type in the box, what comes to mind? For me, when I hear the word punishment, it sounds negative and punitive. I see a comment, discipline. Okay. Trish, any thoughts?
When I hear the word punishment, I just often think of harsh, and sort of retribution, I guess. So let me see if I can articulate this. In my mind, lots of times when we're punishing kids, in lesson 1 a couple weeks back, we talked about the Latin root of the word discipline, meaning to teach or to guide. And I think because as parents, we're often emotionally triggered in the moment when we are dealing with disciplinary situations, right? The kids have displayed some sort of inappropriate behavior that we don't necessarily appreciate. And that pushes our buttons and kind of gets our emotions going, whether that's anxiety or anger, frustration, impatience, whatever. And then I think if we're not careful to sort of monitor that response, then the disciplinary reaction we give almost becomes more about paying back that behavior than it does about teaching or guiding. So
exactly.
I think there's a moment sometimes in a lot of our reactions that sort of feels like, you want to make me miserable? I'll show you miserable. And then we start doling out punishments from that place. And so that's what I mean when I say retribution, because I think in a lot of places, or in a lot of scenarios, it feels like it's more about evening the score with the kid than it is about teaching or guiding a lesson.
Yep, absolutely. So as you think about punishment, and you think about how you were punished as a child, how does that impact how you punish now as a parent? For me, I've taken a lot of how I was punished, because it very much was a form of just discipline. So I take how I was punished and I incorporate that into my parenting style. However, I try to add in a little more communication with my kids. My mom did a pretty good job at communicating with me. My dad, not so much. So that's kind of it for me. Any other thoughts on how you were punished? How does that influence how you punish today?
For me, I was spanked fairly frequently as a kid, and we're gonna spend a whole week, not a whole week, but a whole session next week, kind of exploring the idea of spanking a little bit more. But for me, it didn't feel effective, and so it is a technique that I have chosen not to carry forward with my kids. But I think in a lot of other ways, my parents were really great at disciplining because they didn't tend to overreact to situations. So I have a little saying, don't kill a housefly with a bazooka, meaning small problem, small reaction, big problem, bigger reaction. And I think that overall, my parents were actually really good at don't kill a housefly with a bazooka. So that's something that I try to practice with my own kids and be very mindful of.
And a comment here is I feel it sets a standard, whether it's what you don't want or how you think punishment is. And I think that's a great, it does set a standard for us. And, you know, I talk to a lot of parents and, you know, they either don't punish the way they were because they didn't like it themselves, or punish the way they were punished because that's all they know. So very much, I think that's a great comment. I appreciate that. It very much sets a standard, and it can go either way. So I think kind of as we think about that, it's a good question to continue to ask ourselves, because it can help kind of set our compass, kind of set our direction for, okay, I didn't like how I was punished, so maybe I need to rethink how I'm punishing. Or, you know what? I was punished. I was disciplined well. I like how it was done. I need to make sure that's how I do it. So, great. So as we move forward here, talking about discipline, we're going to talk about 3 types of consequences that we can use. And if you remember, a consequence is simply a reaction to a response, right? Or, yeah. So all actions have consequences, good and negative. So the first one we're going to talk about is natural consequence. And this is something that happens all by themselves. There's no planning. There's nothing that we have to do as parents. It's just something that's naturally set in place. So you touch a hot stove and you're going to get burned. Natural consequences are probably one of the best to use. However, they should only be used, obviously, when it's safe. We don't want to teach toddlers not to play in the road by letting them play in a road, for obvious reasons. So natural consequences are also important to keep in mind: age and developmental stage and appropriateness. So for someone in high school, I'll give you an example. My son and daughter. With my daughter, I very much can, if she comes down and says, I just don't want to study for this test, I can tell her, she's in high school, I can say, well, that's your choice. If you choose not to study for the test, you know how that might affect your grade. And she will go and study because that reminder, she cares about her grades. I could not take that approach with my son because he would just be like, yep, whatever. He didn't have that same focus, right, that she does. Every child's different. So you need to know your kid, and you need to know, is this going to work or is it going to backfire? Was that clear, Trish? I felt like I kind of talked in circles.
No, I thought that was clear.
Okay.
My rule of thumb when I'm evaluating, is this a situation where natural consequence is appropriate? Just like you said, unless it's a matter of health or safety,
Yeah.
or it seriously compromises our family values, I oftentimes will just let nature take its course and let the natural consequences roll. I say, natural consequences are sort of like when the universe doles out the consequences for the child. And I think that the reason that they're often the most effective is that it takes the parent out of the equation. So if my child does something and there is a natural consequence that I didn't have to set in motion, it just happened all by itself. When I am removed from the equation, then it takes away that opportunity for him to focus on the bitterness or the resentfulness towards me for handing down that punishment. So I think it often will open kids' eyes in terms of like, oh yeah, I caused that to happen, or my behavior caused that to happen. So if it's a safe and healthy choice, and it doesn't seriously compromise your family values, and if the consequence is going to come fairly quickly, then I usually try to let those natural consequences roll out. If it's going to take a long time for the universe to bite them in the backside over that choice, then maybe they're not going to put two and two together and go, oh, you know why this happened? It's because 6 months ago I did such and such. It's probably not going to be real powerful a message at that point.
Exactly. And that's a really good point, Trish. Keep in mind that the younger kids have a different view of time than adults do. Their brains aren't fully developed. They don't have those cognitive reasoning skills yet, like an adult would. So 6 months to us is a lot longer to a child. So when you're thinking about letting those natural consequences play out, it's important to think about the time frame. If it's almost immediate, great. If it's weeks, it depends on how old your kid is. If it's months, probably need to think about, okay, maybe I need to put a logical consequence in here, which is our next one. So logical consequences are planned and thought out. And there's something that requires us as parents or guardians to kind of step in and dole out, right? So the example here is if you hit your brother, you receive a timeout. So it's something that ties to the behavior. If we keep in mind the point of discipline, which is to teach and guide, then it's very, very important that our logical consequence directly ties to the behavior. If it does not, it's not teaching anything. And it can leave the child confused, hurt, and angry. And that is the exact opposite of what we're trying to do. So that would be a random consequence. So a random consequence has no direct connection to behavior. It's given out impulsively. We've all done it. Our kids do something, we get mad, we react, and we throw something out that makes absolutely no sense. And we can probably sit back and go, man, why did I do that? That doesn't make any sense. Now what do I do?
Right.
You go back to your child and you say, you know what? that was a little unreasonable. I'm sorry. Let's talk about what a reasonable consequence is.
Yeah.
Um, that does a lot of things. Um, it checks a box in the respect column. So your child's going to be like, oh, wow, my parents are reasonable. They're willing to discuss this with me. So it builds that mutual respect. It teaches humility because it's really hard to admit when you made a mistake. And we want to teach that for our kids. We want to model that for our kids. So it teaches humility. And it just lets them know that you're a reasonable person and you're just trying to help them. So completely okay and highly encouraged when you do throw something out that's not reasonable. Take a step back, come back together, apologize, and regroup. It's okay.
Yeah. I think I've made reference to this before, but many years ago I used to be a Dr. Phil watcher, and Dr. Phil used to use the terminology, you know, your child's currency, right?
Mm.
So you know what that thing is that maybe motivates them or really upsets them if they lose it. For a lot of kids these days, it's technology based. I find more and more, you know, parents oftentimes out of desperation, child shows some sort of inappropriate behavior, and whatever it is, whether it's related to the telephone, the iPad, the video games, the television or not, that's often our go-to, because we know that for a lot of kids, that's like the center of their world, especially right now. And if you want to really get their attention, that's the thing that you grab onto and yank away. But if the behavior didn't have anything to do with the electronics in the first place, then I would say that falls into the category of random consequences. And those tend to generate more of the bitterness, on the part of the children, more of that resentful attitude, I think, because to them, I think it looks more like a power play than a teachable moment. You know, mom's just trying to, you know, throw her weight around. Dad's just being a jerk. You know, they know how much I love my whatever, and so they took it away from me, whatever that thing is. So in some instances, I do think that those electronic devices, whatever they may be, are directly linked to behaviors. There have been multiple times where, you know, Claire has not followed directions because she was busy watching TV and ignoring whatever we told her to do. And as a result, she lost the rest of her TV time for the night for, you know, being defiant about the directions, because the TV was, you know, that she was hung up on that and not willing to do what we had asked her to do. There was a logical connection. Unfortunately, we're at the point with her now, she's 9. And well, I say unfortunately, it's not really unfortunate. It's actually probably very fortunate, because for myself, if I am taking like a self inventory, the moments where I tend to give random consequences are when I am the most triggered, the most impatient, the most frustrated, the most impulsive. When I'm not slowing down, taking a breath, thinking it through, that's when my random consequences tend to show up. And you know, she's, I think, has heard enough discussion in our household about consequences and how we try to approach consequences in our household, that now she will say to me, if I throw out a random consequence, she will say to me, that is not fair, that has nothing to do with what I did. Because she knows that's kind of a family value in our house, is that your, you know, your consequence should have something to do with your behavior. So it helps keep me in check a little bit. When she says that, I try to take a step back and say, you know what, you're right. Let's see if we can think of something that is a little more directly connected to the problem, that will help you learn a different behavior for handling it. Because I think there's something also to be said for involving kids in, um, deciding their consequences. and what they're going to be, so that, you know, I was listening to a podcast this morning, Lynn Lyons, who's a psychologist, and she does a lot of work around anxiety and helping families deal with anxiety. And she was telling a story about when her children were little and they stayed up all night playing video games. And when she got up in the morning and found them still playing their video games, she said to them, I'm going to the gym, and when I come back, I'd like to hear from you what you think the consequence should be for this action. And she already had, you know, sort of in her mind what she thought would be an appropriate consequence. And when she came back and talked to her sons, the consequence that they had come up with was far worse than what she had intended to offer up. So I think in most cases that is how it goes when kids sort of have a say in what their consequence is. They tend to be much harder on themselves than we would have been on them in the first place. So involving them in those conversations, I think, can be valuable as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Great. So we're gonna spend a little bit of time here talking about specific logical consequences as punishment. And the curriculum outlines 5. So the first one that we're going to talk about is loss of privilege. Loss of privilege is appropriate for children 2.5 years and older. And this is a privilege is a right granted by parent or family. So watching TV, staying up past bedtime, playing with a special toy, electronics, those are all examples of privileges. If you have older kids, driving is a privilege. So things of that nature. If a child misuses the object or privilege, then they lose it for a while. Great example, an easy example is video games. If they're constantly losing their temper and throwing the remote control, then maybe they lose it, the video game, for a little while until they can learn to control their anger.
Or if you've got 2 siblings and they're fighting over
Yep.
a toy or a privilege or whatever, and you've stepped in as a parent to offer some problem-solving strategies to them, and they're just not responding to those problem-solving strategies, then losing whatever that privilege is that they're arguing over could be a very logical consequence.
And again, I know I sound like a broken record, but keep in mind that our point of all of this is to try and teach. So I love loss of privilege, especially with the staying up late thing. So let's say that your child has a show that they really like to watch and it's past their bedtime when it ends. So you can say to them, okay, I will let you stay up tonight and watch this show. However, if you can't get out of bed tomorrow morning when you need to, then you will not be able to stay up again to watch this show. So what you've done is you have created some consistency for them, and you've given them the privilege of staying up, but you have laid out the consequence ahead of time so they fully know and understand what the expectations are. That doesn't mean they're going to necessarily remember it, or at least admit that they remember it, but you've laid it out, you've done your work, you've laid the groundwork. So it teaches them that in order for me to do this, I have to do that. So that's kind of goes back to that if, then, when, then stuff. So, and when you're talking about loss of privilege, I think it's important to, go back and follow up. Say, now remember, you can earn this privilege back, but you have to earn it back. I'm not just going to give it to you. So whatever that looks like, and a lot of this plays into what your family values and morals are.
That's a great point, Steve, about, letting kids know what's the length of time we're talking about that I've lost this privilege for. and making sure that we're being reasonable when we say what it will be. I think, again, one of those things that when we're being too impulsive because we are angry in the situation is we have a tendency to over punish. So instead of losing a privilege for a day or 2 days, it's weeks and weeks and months. And the likelihood of us as parents actually following through with those really extended time periods where kids have lost their privileges is probably pretty small. So if we say, you've lost your driving privileges for a month, and then a week into it, we're tired of shuttling our kid around again, and we give him his keys back, what message are we giving in that instance, right? So being thoughtful ahead of time about what's a reasonable amount of time, that we'll be able to follow through and that will be effective in teaching the child the lesson that I'm trying to teach, so that we don't end up sort of backpedaling our consequences all the time. And then there was something else I was going to say. What was it? Oh, and about making sure that we're giving. So if the whole point of this disciplinary system is to teach and guide children's choices, we have to give them opportunities to show us that they have learned the lesson we intended to teach, right?
Exactly.
So if a child misuses a toy and they lose it indefinitely, right? We threw it away. You don't get to have Play-Doh anymore. That's a personal deep wound of mine because I was not allowed to play with Play-Doh as a child because I got it in the carpet. So, the child gets Play-Doh in the carpet and they're never allowed to use Play-Doh again. How will we know if they learned the valuable lesson about not, about keeping the Play-Doh where it needs to be? So making sure that the consequence is a reasonable length of time, and then we hand that privilege back.
Yep.
Because I trust that you're going to show me that you learned
And
what we talked about.
to that point, and this is kind of one of my soapbox things, we spend in our society a lot of energy trying to keep our kids safe. Kids need to fall down, and I'm not saying that we just let them go crazy and do whatever they want. We obviously have to keep our kids safe, but we also need to give them opportunities to fall down, and then we need to be there to pick them up, brush them off, teach them, and then let them try it again. I can't tell you how many times my daughter fell off her bike when she was learning how to ride it. It would have been, if my wife had her choice, she never would have let her ride a bike. And my 16-year-old would not know how to ride a bike. That's not acceptable. They have to fall down, but we have to be there to mitigate the risk and to be there to teach, provide consistency, and follow up. So
yeah, there's got to be some kind of a middle ground, right, between
yeah,
running wild and bubble wrapping them. There's got to be a happy medium in there somewhere.
Big soapbox of mine. Trish knows that.
I do indeed.
All right, so the next one is being grounded. So we don't necessarily use this correctly in our society, so I'm going to kind of clarify that a little bit. So being grounded is for kids ages 2.5 years and older. And when we use grounded, we use it a lot with teenagers when they break curfew or we don't let them go out. Really what that is that's a loss of privilege. So being grounded is really when we're actually physically restricting them from a specific area. So for example, when a child repeatedly leaves a yard or an area purposefully without permission, then an appropriate logical consequence as punishment is to be grounded to the yard or to the house for a period of time. So, okay, Johnny, I told you if you left the yard again without permission, you are going to have to stay inside for the rest of the afternoon. That's being grounded. He's grounded from the yard, or he's grounded to the house. He has to be in the house. Again, the way we use grounded kind of with older kids really is just a loss of privilege. It's just a different way to say loss of privilege. Any thoughts on when this could be used as other than the example I just gave, when this could be used as a form of punishment?
I would say when a child is not where they are supposed to be, then when they're supposed to be there, then restricting their sort of freedom to roam is a logical consequence. So if you've got an older child who, was supposed to be in by 9 o'clock and she doesn't roll in until 9:30 or 10 o'clock, perhaps she has to stay in the house next weekend. That would be being grounded. Or you've got a kid who was supposed to be coming home after school, and they took a detour to a neighbor's house and went and hung out with their friend for a while, and you didn't know where they were. Then, perhaps having to ride the bus straight home from school for the next week or two would be an appropriate grounding.
Yep, absolutely. And then a comment we have here is when they aren't listening to what they need to be doing in order to ensure their safety. So yeah, actually an example I had plays right into that. When my son was younger, he was horrible in stores. Like, he would not stay with you. It was terrible. And one day my wife and I were shopping I think it was at Walmart or something, and he disappeared. And we freaked out, and we were looking everywhere for him. And after, it felt like an eternity, but it probably was only a couple minutes, from inside one of the clothing racks, you hear he. He had crawled inside the rack and was hiding in there. And so I took him out and made him sit in the car with me while my wife finished the shopping, which utterly destroyed him because he wanted to be a part, We had to sit in the car and wait for her to finish, because he couldn't stay with us. So that was for his safety, for one, because, you can't just wander off in the store. All right, great. So the next piece is restitution and payback. This is appropriate for children 3 to 4 years and older. And this means paying for some misdeed, either with money or extra chores. Restitution in the form of money is effective only when the child has means of income, such as an allowance or a job. So in my example of the video game throwing the controller earlier with loss of privilege, you could use that here as well if they broke it. If they had a way to earn money to pay for that video game controller, you could say, you know what, you're not going to be able to play your video game until you can afford to purchase a new controller. What a lot of parents do that I do not encourage is they will go out, buy the controller, and then say, well, you'll have to pay me back. Well, they're still playing the video game while, and a lot of times we don't necessarily follow up. We forget. If you do that, I highly encourage you to make sure they pay you back. Don't let them play it until they pay you back. It's really not teaching them anything. They need to feel that disconnection of having that for the period of time it takes them to earn the money. If I crash my car and I don't have insurance and I don't have money in the bank to buy a new one, I'm going to have to feel the pain of not having a car until I can figure out how to get a new one.
Mhm.
That's just a natural, that's a natural consequence. But anyways, any thoughts?
Um, one that we used with my son, he was about 14, I think, when he got his first cavity. And not great about taking care of his teeth despite constant nagging. Um, and so, he had his tooth filled. And I told him, this was your only freebie. This is your opportunity to learn. Um, you know, what happens when you don't take care of your teeth, what it felt like to get the filling. Here, have a look at the invoice so you know how much this just cost me. That was your only freebie. And if you have any subsequent cavities, you're going to be paying 50% of whatever the bill is. And he did have a job at the time. So, he had a means of income to be able to contribute to paying his own filling. He hasn't had any
Yeah.
fillings.
And so that's a great point, Trish. I'm glad you brought that up. If you notice, Trish said that he had to pay 50%. So I think it's great when we can kind of negotiate and compromise with our kids, especially when it comes to this sort of thing, because one, we don't want to just throw them into real life, because that is real life. As an adult, if I don't take care of my teeth and I get a cavity, I'm going to have to deal with the consequences of that. And as we're trying to raise adults, we're trying to raise kids to become adults, but not just throwing them into it 100%, because that's just setting them up for failure. But being willing to compromise and negotiate are good skills to teach, and they're good skills to model. So I think that's important to keep in mind.
One other thing to keep in mind, I think, with payback is it doesn't always have to come in the form of payment, monetary payment. So if you've got a child, for example, who breaks a sibling's toy, perhaps having to give that sibling one of their toys is a way you create that payback or restitution type of situation. If you've got a little one who knocks over sister's tower that she just spent 10 minutes building, then having to contribute some labor to rebuild that tower can
Yep.
be a form of payback or restitution. So I think we can sometimes get creative about how we require our kids to pay back their mistakes.
Yep, absolutely. An example I saw somewhere, I can't remember where, it was in one of our curriculums, but a brother asked to borrow his other brother's baseball glove.
Nope, freeze! You're getting out of yourself. That's
I
one of our
am.
punishment scenarios.
Oh, it is?
It
Oh, I'll stop. I'll stop.
is.
See, it all blends together.
It all blends together, Steve. It's okay.
All right, let's
Hold
move
that,
on.
hold that thought.
Um, Parental disappointment is the next one. This is one of my favorites. So this is appropriate for children 3 to 4 years and older. And it's a simple statement which expresses disappointment a parent feels for a behavior a child has chosen to perform. Am I frozen or are you frozen, Trish?
Um,
I'm
I
going to
can
go with
still hear
Trish.
you. No,
Okay, you can? Must
I
be,
can hear
okay.
you. Yeah.
Um, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so the intent is to build awareness in the child of the parent's disappointment. So, I don't know whose issue it is, mine or yours.
I'm not seeing anything weird.
Okay, you just kept freezing, so I wanted to make
Oh,
sure. But you're good now. All right.
yeah.
All right, so I'm going to give you a personal example of parental disappointment. When I was a freshman, and Trish has heard this a million times, sorry. When I was a freshman in college, my first semester, I loved all the free time college gave me. I mean, man, I had all this free time. Well, when I got my grades at the end of the semester, I realized why they give you all that free time. You needed to study. And when my dad got my grades, because he was paying the bill, he got the grades. I thought he was going to kill me because I made academic warning list, and I thought he one of the family values in my home was education was extremely important. So I thought he was going to kill me. He came into the room. He had that letter in his hand. He didn't even sit down. He just looked at me. He had the letter and he said, "I'm extremely disappointed in you. I know you're capable of so much more." He turned around and he walked out. And that happened 24 years ago, and I feel like it happened this morning.
Mm-hmm.
So parental disappointment carries a lot of weight. However, it only carries weight if there's a good relationship with your kids. So if there's mutual respect, I had a ton of mutual respect for my parents. What they thought of me meant a lot to me, and it still does. So, but that was only the case because we had a lot of quality time together. They respected me as a person, even as a child. They respected me, and because of that, I respected them. So, parental disappointment works really, really well when there's, I guess, three things involved: quality time, mutual respect, and you don't overuse it. If you're constantly throwing that out, you know, I'm disappointed in you. I'm so disappointed. Finally, they're just going to be like, whatever. I can't do anything to make you happy. So what's the point? So don't overuse it. Make sure there's quality time and mutual respect. Thoughts on that, Trish?
No, I think you covered that really well. I think, I have a similar type of a story from when I was a teenager, and it was probably the most impactful, one of those very lasting memories. And it also just centered around my mom saying, I could not believe um, that was true, that you would do that. I was so disappointed when I found out, and that was it. That was the end of the punishment. There wasn't anything after that. And you better believe I never did that again.
Right.
Um, but it is also one of those things that has really sat and lasted over the years.
So when we're talking about punishment, Trish said something that reminded me. If you don't need something else, don't do extra. Like, so Trish said that and for me, there wasn't anything more. There wasn't any more punishment. I didn't get grounded. I didn't get anything else. It was just the weight of that was enough, right? We don't want to set our kids up to fail, and we don't want to give them a feeling of hopelessness, because if they have that feeling of hopelessness, then they're just going to give up. So if we just continue to pile on the consequences, that's not helpful either. So I just think it's important to kind of get that out there. All right. Punishment scenarios.
You missed one.
Huh?
You missed timeout.
I missed timeout. I missed timeout because I hate this one. So timeout is appropriate for children 3 to 10 years old. And this is a systematic removal of a child to a quiet area. So we're going to, Trisha's going to discuss timeout in further detail in a little bit.
Yep.
All right, punishment scenarios. So I'm going to read some scenarios, and then if you guys want to type into the chat box which one you think it is, you can just write A, B, C, D, or E. You can write which one you think should be used.
And let's stress for a minute, there is no wrong answer to this question. I think it depends on the parenting style, and sometimes it depends on the age of the child or the temperament of the child. So what we're really looking for is sort of your interpretation. In this situation, which one of these consequences seems the most logical to you in terms of connecting the consequence to the behavior?
Yep, absolutely. All right, so here's our first one. Your 5-year-old knows that she must put away her toys when done using them. You walk into the living room and find toys all over the floor, but your 5-year-old is now playing with a doll in her bedroom. You ask her to come and put her toys away, and she shouts, no. You ask again. She shouts, no, again. What type of punishment would you consider? Loss of privilege, being grounded, restitution or payback, parental disappointment, or timeout? So I've got loss of privilege.
I'm curious on loss of privilege. Can you add what privilege you would consider taking away? Taking the toy away. Okay.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
Personally, that's how I would go with it too. I think that's a great scenario where you can logically connect the behavior with a loss of privilege.
Absolutely. All right, I'm gonna put some stars up here. All right, next one.
Sorry, hold on. Okay.
All right, in your house, you have a rule that everyone must use appropriate language, no swearing. You've been working on this rule for a while as a family. Your 12-year-old son is playing a video game with a friend in the living room. It's loud because the two of them are in a fierce competition. Suddenly, your son makes a wrong move and he loses the game. He responds with an explosion of curse words. What type of punishment would you use? So same, A, loss of privilege, B, being grounded, restitution, parental disappointment, or timeout. Okay, so I have restriction with the game.
So technically that sounds like a loss of privilege.
Yep. For me, I would probably do, I might do a little bit of two things here. So I might say, okay, you can play the video game for the rest of the afternoon, and your friend needs to go home now. So that's probably both loss of privilege, but.
And I might start off with a parental disappointment statement and see if that's enough to take care of the problem while the friend is there. Let them kind of resume their playing and see if they can correct their behavior just as a result of that parental disappointment statement. And then if it happens again, I would take out a little bit of a bigger consequence. So at that point, I might say loss of privilege. Hey, I would probably personally choose one or the other. Your friend can stay, but obviously you guys can't handle this game together, so go find something else to do. Or, you know what, I don't want to be responsible for exposing little Johnny to that kind of language, so I'm going to have to call his mom and ask her to come and pick him up now.
Yep. And a comment we have is make him write things down of how he should have done it the right way and why he got in trouble for doing it the wrong way. Play the pros and cons game, make them take a break from the game. Yep. So it sounds like loss of privilege. And I used to make my son write letters all the time. I used to do that all the time. I personally like it, but
I like that last point too, where it says make them take a break from the game. So earlier on, we talked about giving kids an opportunity to prove that they've learned the lesson.
yeah.
So where my first instinct might be take the game away for the entire afternoon, as I really rethink it, I think maybe losing the game for an hour or 2 hours, go find something else to do, and then you guys can come back and try again and see if you have learned anything from that little break from it. I think a lot of it, again, it depends on the child, it depends on the scenario. You know, if this is something that you have dealt with over and over again and it's a recurring problem, then you have to take out, I think, bigger weapons in that instance. But if it's something that is sort of new and novel, I like to start small and work my way up.
Yep, absolutely. And keep in mind that, you know, yeah, starting small and working up is always easier than doing it the other way. So, all right, ready for the next one. All right. Your 8-year-old son is playing baseball this spring. His glove from last year is too small. He borrows his older brother's glove and after getting distracted by the neighborhood kids, leaves it out in the front yard overnight. It downpours and the glove is ruined. What type of punishment would you consider? A, loss of privilege. B, being grounded. C, restitution payback. D, parental disappointment or timeout. Whoops. Sorry, I just messed up my chat box. C, replace the glove. Yep, that's the one.
Sorry, I also see make him buy a new one for his older brother. So that's the restitution or payback that we were getting at. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
That's a
perfect.
Good one. A no-brainer, I think.
All right.
Great. Okay, so is it my turn, Steve?
I think it's your turn.
Because I've been sitting here quietly, not saying anything at all the entire time that we've been working. That was a joke because obviously I can't keep my mouth closed that long. So, as a sort of a summary, I guess, we have this, we usually give this in the form of a handout when you come to class, just 12 basic rules of discipline that are kind of overarching and cover a lot of the things that we've already talked about. The first one, help children learn appropriate behaviors by involving them in direct experiences. So what I always think of when I look at this one is, if kids have never been placed in a situation before, then they're obviously not necessarily going to know how to act in that situation. If I want my kids to learn how to behave appropriately in church, I'm going to have to take them to church. You know, I'll probably have a proactive conversation about it, and then I'm going to give them a chance to sort of test those skills out. So if we don't ever give kids experiences with things, then they don't ever learn how to handle those things. Number two, all behaviors need consequences. So again, we've talked about, you know, we've kind of talked this to death, but I think it's a big, big point in this curriculum. Positive behaviors need positive consequences. Our kids have to get that positive feedback, even if it's just a high five or a wink. They need to get that positive feedback that lets them know, yep, you're on track, you did it right. And then the negative behaviors need some negative consequences. Otherwise, kids think, well, I know there's a rule about that, but nothing happens if I don't follow it, so it's not a big deal anyway.
And really, they need that positive reaction more than they need that negative.
Yes, because number 3, what you pay attention to is what you get more of, right?
Ding,
So,
ding, ding, ding.
ding, 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 you're the winner, Steve. Yeah, I think we're all super good at paying lots of attention to the things that we don't want happening. I always say, if my kids are doing something wrong, I'm going to notice it, and I'm going to notice it aloud. But when they are doing what they're supposed to be doing, I have a tendency to be like, just tiptoe through and don't say anything, because if I interrupt it, it might stop. So shh, don't jinx it, that kind of a thing. That's not actually how it works. We need to pay attention to the things that we want more of. Number 4, punishments should be used to help children change inappropriate behavior. So we talked about this at the beginning of the session, right? Where our knee-jerk reaction in a disciplinary situation, especially if we have been triggered emotionally into a place where we are frustrated, angry, embarrassed, impatient, our knee-jerk reaction might be to use a punishment to even the score with our kids. You are making me utterly miserable right now, and I am going to show you what miserable can look like now. I think that is where we have a tendency to come from when we are having our buttons pushed by our kids. But really, the punishments should be used to teach kids about their inappropriate behaviors and appropriate behaviors that need to replace them. Punishments should never be used to abuse, not physically, not emotionally, not used for abuse. Timeout will only work if time in is quality time. And again, I don't think that's appropriate just for timeout. I think all disciplinary tactics or techniques work better when you have a strong relationship with your child. And the way you get that strong relationship with your child is by investing that quality time in with them. That's when, the fact that you're expressing parental disappointment is going to make a difference, because your kids have that mutual respect that Steve talked about, and they care about your opinion. The next one, timeout should be used sparingly, and we're going to dive into a longer conversation about timeout in a minute. But if you're doing it over and over and over again, if you've got a toddler and you've just timed them out 10 times in the last 20 minutes, something's not working. You might want to change your approach a little bit. Punishment should fit the crime. So there's the logical consequences we've been talking about so much today. When there is a direct connection between the behavior and the consequence, kids take more learning away from the situation, and they tend not to sit and stew in the bitterness about the mean thing that their parent made them do for a punishment. And then punishments should be meaningful and quick. So it does not have to drag on for a very long time in most cases for kids to get the point and make a change in their behavior. Start small. You can always add to it. You can always take away from it too, right? Steve talked about that a little bit earlier, those moments of humility where, maybe in the heat of the moment, you opened your mouth and impulsively gave a punishment that you later, after calming down, recognize was a little more harsh or lengthy than it really needed to be. It is possible to model humility to your kids in those instances and go to them and say, you know what? Sometimes when I talk while I'm angry, I don't choose the right words. And now that I've calmed down and I've taken a step back and looked at that situation, I think I might have been a little too hard on you. And so I'm still disappointed in this behavior. It does need to change, but I'm rethinking the consequence that I gave you. And I think we're going to try this instead. It's okay to model humility to your kids like that. I think that is part of what generates that mutual respect that Steve was talking about earlier. If you misuse it, you lose it. There's a logical consequence. If you break it, you pay for it. Another logical consequence. And never punish babies, because developmentally they just simply don't have the understanding to learn from the consequences of their behaviors. They just need a lot of repetition, direct teaching, redirection. That's how babies learn. And it can be a frustrating and exhausting process for parents of infants and toddlers, but it's a necessary one. It's a step that we have to take to get them to a place where they can understand more sophisticated consequences. All right, so let's talk a little bit about timeout. I'm just going to move forward with the assumption that everyone has used timeout in some form or another as a consequence for a child at some point in their lives. So we're going to spend a few minutes kind of going through the steps of giving a child a timeout in the way that the curriculum recommends. And then if everyone will tolerate it for a minute, I will take off my facilitator's hat and put on my real life mom hat and tell you sort of my take on it or how I see it. And anytime that I put on my real life mom hat and tell you where I think things are at, please feel free to ignore me. I didn't write a curriculum. I just live with a whole bunch of children, and I'm just mucking through the best I can, just like everybody else. So, all right, so let's talk about the curriculum first and how they recommend that you play out a timeout. So, timeout is appropriate for kids 2.5 and older. And it can be used when a child seriously violates one of the family rules. Now, we've spent a lot of time talking about logical consequences in the last hour. So I would say if you really want the timeout to be a logical consequence, it should be directly related to behaviors that make it unsafe or, you know, less pleasant for them to be around other people. So if you've got siblings who are at each other's throats for a time, you know what? You guys need to spend some time apart from each other in a timeout. You know, if you've got a kid who is being unsafe, hitting other kids, throwing toys, things like that, you know what? In order to protect everybody's safety, you're going to have to take a timeout for a little while. You know, those are, in my opinion, instances where taking a timeout is a logical consequence. I don't think we always use it as a logical consequence. I think it's sometimes is one of those things that we use it always as our go-to for everything that a child does. And so if that's a practice that you're used to, you might want to take a second look and say, all right, what instances is it really logical for a child to be removed from a social situation, and which instances is it not? So timeout is the temporary isolation of a child when the child chooses to act inappropriately. It lets them know that when they choose to behave inappropriately, they have to be by themselves for a while, sitting quietly. The golden rule of timeout in this curriculum: timeout will only work if time in is quality time. If your kids aren't missing out on anything exciting anyway, they probably don't care that they've been removed. And if you don't have that strong relationship as a result of lots of quality time in, then probably removing the child from the situation is also not going to carry a lot of weight. So here are the steps that the curriculum recommends using before and while you are using timeout with your kids. So first of all, before you use a timeout, I would say before you use punishment, period, making sure that you've clearly established the family rules, right? So it's not necessarily fair to punish a child for breaking a rule that they didn't know existed in the first place. Make sure that the child really understands the timeout process, and don't try to teach it while you're also trying to discipline with it. So it's worth taking the time to explain and teach the process ahead of time. When I taught kindergarten, we used to do this all the time. We called it take a break instead of timeout in the kindergarten classroom. But we spent a lot of time talking about what our take a break process looked like. Where do you go? How do you sit? What does your body look like? What does your voice sound like? How will you know when it's time for you to come back to the group? And every child, even that child who never broke a rule in their entire life, every child practiced getting up from the group on the floor, going over to the take a break spot, sitting quietly, judging when they were done with their take a break, and coming back again. That helped to ensure that the children understood the system. That way, when there was a problem, they knew they had some sort of muscle memory, if you will, about what this was going to look like, how it was going to go. Because emotionally charged moments are not teachable moments. You don't want to be trying to teach new skills while you or the child are in sort of a ramped up state. So pick a spot. Ideally, you want to have a consistent spot so that every time the child is asked to take a timeout, they take it in that same spot. And also establish how long that timeout is going to last. A rule of thumb that a lot of people use is 1 minute for each year of the child's age. So 2 minutes for a 2-year-old, 5 minutes for a 5-year-old, etc. I would say when it comes to establishing time, that can vary a bit depending on the child. If you have a child who really struggles with sitting still and that's your expectation and timeout, I might reduce the time a little bit so that they can feel the success of it and you can move into the next part, which is processing with them what happened to get them into the timeout in the first place. So if you're in a situation where a timeout feels warranted, the steps that the curriculum recommends, give the child one warning. So the example they give here is, Tom, please stop acting silly at the dinner table and use proper table manners. If you continue to act silly, you'll have to leave the table and take a 2-minute timeout. Okay, there's your warning. If the behavior continues, tell the child they need to go to the timeout. So in my house, I always hope my husband doesn't listen to these recordings because sometimes I make fun of him a little bit, but I love him. In my house, sometimes rather than saying it's time to go to timeout, he will say to my daughter, do you need a timeout right now? And I always say, why are you asking her? Like, that's not, either you're giving her one or you're not. Just take a stand and move forward with it. Don't ask her if she needs a timeout. Of course, she's going to say no. So don't ask, just tell. You need to go to timeout. Once you say that, the chances are that's when your child is going to like apologize, try to negotiate. I won't do it anymore. No, I'm done. I'm done. I'm done. I'm good. I don't have to. Don't buy it. Once the words have come out of your mouth, you need to go take a timeout. You're going to need to be prepared to follow through with that. Otherwise, you're setting up a system where the child thinks that begging, pleading, and promising and negotiating are going to get them out of trouble every time. So once you've said it, follow through. Let them know how long it's going to last. Again, some of this depends on what your expectations are in timeout. If your expectation is that the timer is not going to start until the child is sitting quietly, then they need to have practiced that and know that ahead of time. Remind them, oh, sorry, that was the next bullet. Remind them that the timeout starts when they're quiet. And when they're sitting quietly, then you can start the timer. After the timeout, praise them that you did a nice job getting settled. Thank you for doing your timeout, and redirect them to a more appropriate behavior. Here, I think that the curriculum here, the notes, grossly undervalue that last piece. For me, I think timeout is all about the processing that happens afterwards. So I'll talk more about that when I talk about my take on timeout. I think that there are some potential inherent problems with the timeout system, and the curriculum acknowledges these as well. Personally, I think sometimes timeout has varying degrees of success with kids depending on their temperament or their like sort of personality style. My son, who just turned 18, you could follow this timeout procedure that I just laid out to you. You could have followed it to the letter. He would have responded exactly the way you expected him to respond to all of those things. He would have, maybe fussed a bit when he first was going into timeout, but he would have settled down. He would have done his 3 minutes, his 5 minutes, his whatever. And then he would be ready to go and would have sort of hit the reset button and is ready to move on with life. That's great. He's that kid. My daughter, who's 9 right now, is not that kid. She is the kid who is going to fight with you all the way there. She's going to refuse to go. And when she was 2, it was pretty easy to pick her up and take her and plunk her where you wanted her to go. But now she's 9.5. So what am I going to do if she physically refuses to go, right? I sort of, you can find yourself in a place where you've set yourself up to not be able to handle it anymore. What do I do if she doesn't go? Or if she gets there and she doesn't sit quietly? She's also that kid that if I had said, you have a 5-minute timeout, the timer will start when you're being quiet, and then she's finally quiet and I start the timer, and she would probably sit there quietly for like 4 minutes and 58 seconds. And then when there's literally 2 minutes left, she'd be like, boop, 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 just to see if you would reset the timer again. She's that kid. She likes to control situations, and she likes to see how people are going to react to them. So this kind of a system doesn't work real well with her. And I think that that's kind of a common temperament that kids have. There are some kids that are, I think, just predisposed to power struggle with people. And this system, in my opinion, again, taking off my facilitator's hat and putting on my experienced mom hat, I think that this system sort of sets us up to have power struggles with kids like that. So it's not that we don't use timeout with her and with other kids who have a similar temperament, but in my personal opinion, I don't use timeout as a punishment or a consequence for her or kids like her. I use it as a means to an end with her. And this is where I say I think the curriculum sort of undervalues that conversation that's happening afterwards. I'm not really teaching her a whole lot by sitting her in a chair and asking her to be quiet for a short period of time. The teaching about appropriate behavior comes afterwards in that conversation. I can't have that conversation with her while she's escalated and while she's pushing my buttons and escalating me. That's, in my opinion, the real value of the timeout. Is it breaks us out of that cycle where she's doing something and escalating me, and then I'm doing something and escalating her, and we're going bam, 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 and it's just getting worse and worse and worse. We need to like go to your corners, right? It's like they ring the bell in the boxing ring, ding, 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 ding. Everybody go to your corners. That's what timeout does in our house. It's more like it's more like hitting the reset button.
Yeah.
Than it is like a punishment. It helps de-escalate the situation.
I just want to say that no one wins in a power struggle.
Yeah.
Like no one wins. So if the consequence that you're using creates a constant power struggle, do something different.
Try
right?
something different, yeah.
Definitely. Because no one wins in a power struggle, and all that's doing is frustrating you and frustrating them, and no one's getting taught anything except how to work a power struggle. Yeah.
Yep. So for us, a timeout is more like a reset button. And sometimes I get some pushback on this idea from parents when I'm teaching it. And again, I have my mom hat on right now, so you know, as with all the other ideas, but you are free to take what you think works for you and leave behind the rest. Um, you know, um, one of the bits of advice that I hear a lot from professionals is not to use a child's room for their timeout spot, because they start to associate their bedroom with a place of punishment, and then they don't want to go in there, say to go to bed at night, that sort of thing. Um, I feel like that has a lot to do with how you're approaching the timeout situation. So if you're not using it punitively, like we don't use it punitively, if you're using it as a place where you can get away for a minute and calm yourself down and feel relaxed, then I think that is consistent with the use of a bedroom where you are expected to at night go in and calm down and relax. So, um, you know, other people say, well, I'm not sending them to their room because all of their toys are in there. You know, I personally, when I'm having these big battles, one of the things that I do to decompress is read a book. So, like, you know, I'll send my daughter in for a timeout and I'll open my app on my phone and I'll start reading on my Kindle app on my phone. So if I'm doing something like that to calm myself down, then I feel like giving her that same you know, tool, if you will, to settle herself in her bedroom, that's fine with me. Again, it's a personal choice. For me, it's about de-escalating the situation to the point where we can have a conversation about what your behavior was, what it should have been, and what the consequence is for that behavior. So in my eyes, the timeout is not the consequence. The consequence is coming after we can have a calm and respectful discussion about what the problem was. And the timeout is what helps us get to the place where we can do that. So that's just my sort of 2 cents on timeout. If anybody has anything to add to that, feel free to type it into the chat box. So I'm going to read our takeaway real quick and ask you if you would please respond to it. And then I also just need everybody to type their first and last name in the chat box so that I know you're still here and I can count your hours for today on my attendance sheet. So the takeaway is what's new, one new aspect of punishment that you think you could use in your family this week. And then if you would just type your first and last name in the box, that would be great. Try to, yeah, I think the comment is I've tried to put my boys in their room for timeout and it didn't work. And I think that's not uncommon. I think a lot of people have that same experience. And really, this is about what works for your family and what doesn't work for your family. So if there is a better place for you to execute something like that, I say go for it. You know, the way that it works in one household is not necessarily the way that it works in another household. And sometimes, honestly, it depends on the makeup of the household. So when my son was little, he was the only child in the house. There was nobody there to taunt him when he was in timeout. My daughter has older siblings who might make the process more challenging for her to sit quietly in timeout. So being able to go into her bedroom and close the door so that the brothers aren't poking the bear while she's trying to settle down, that's actually helpful for her. So sometimes, you know, that's a factor in it as well. So if you came late to the presentation today and you would like to make up the missed material, if you want to go through this with me, feel free to reach out via email or text message and let me know, and we can schedule a time to go over the material that you missed in the beginning. But that is all that I have for you today. Anybody have any parting questions or anything? All right. Well, have a great week, and we'll see you guys all next week. Next week's topic is spanking and redirection for kids, using redirection as a discipline technique. So, have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.